In the summer of 1867, a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitmore arrived in the remote East Texas town of Millfield to conduct a revival meeting. What he discovered behind the walls of the old courthouse would haunt him for the rest of his life. 89 men had vanished without a trace over the course of 18 months, all last seen entering Judge Harrison Crawford's courtroom for sentencing. The official records listed them as transferred to state penitentiary, but no prison in Texas had any record of their arrival. When Reverend Whitmore finally uncovered the truth about Crawford's basement chambers, he found evidence of systematic torture, starvation, and murder that would make even the most hardened soul question their faith in humanity. The Methodist Church buried his report for over a century, but recently discovered church archives reveal the horrifying details of what really happened in that courthouse basement, including Crawford's own handwritten journals describing his divine mission to purify souls through suffering. Before we continue with the story of Judge Crawford and the disappearance of those 89 souls, if you're someone who seeks the truth behind America's darkest secrets, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I read every single comment and love connecting with fellow mystery seekers who aren't afraid to confront the shadows of our past. The events that unfolded in Millfield would challenge everything the townspeople believed about justice, faith, and the men they trusted to protect them. But to understand the full horror of what Crawford had created, we must first understand the community that allowed him to operate in plain sight for nearly 2 years. Millfield, Texas, was a town that time seemed to forget, even as it was being built. Nestled in the dense pine forests of East Texas, approximately 40 miles southeast of Marshall, it had emerged during the chaos of Reconstruction as a place where Confederate veterans could start over, far from the prying eyes of federal authorities. The town's population never exceeded 400 souls, but its isolation made it a perfect refuge for those seeking to escape their past, or, as it would turn out, for predators seeking to escape scrutiny. The settlement had been founded in 1864 by Colonel James Millfield, a former Confederate cavalry officer who had purchased several thousand acres of timberland with money he claimed to have saved before the war. The truth, whispered among the townspeople but never spoken aloud, was that Millfield had likely looted the funds from a Union supply train during one of his final raids into Louisiana. But in the lawless atmosphere of post-war Texas, such questions of provenance were considered impolite at best and dangerous at worst. The town itself was laid out in a simple grid pattern, with Main Street running east to west and 3 cross streets dividing the settlement into neat blocks. The business district consisted of a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small hotel called the Pine Grove Inn, and Miller's Saloon, where the men gathered each evening to drink corn whiskey and share stories of the war. Most of the residents lived in modest wooden houses with front porches and vegetable gardens, the kind of simple dwellings that spoke to honest ambitions and limited means. The courthouse sat at the heart of Millfield like a fortress of red brick and limestone, its Gothic revival architecture standing in stark contrast to the modest wooden buildings that surrounded it. Judge Harrison Crawford had commissioned its construction in 1865, sparing no expense despite the town's modest means. The building rose 3 stories above the dusty streets, its pointed arches and decorative stonework giving it the appearance of a medieval cathedral rather than a seat of frontier justice. The courthouse's most distinctive feature was its unusually deep basement, which Crawford claimed was necessary for storing legal documents and evidence in the humid East Texas climate. The basement windows, barely visible above ground level, were fitted with heavy iron bars that Crawford explained were necessary to protect valuable court records from theft. The townspeople never questioned this explanation. After all, Crawford was not only their judge, but also their most prominent citizen, a man who had donated the land for their Methodist church and funded the construction of their schoolhouse. Judge Harrison Crawford himself was an imposing figure who commanded respect through sheer physical presence as much as legal authority. Standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a military bearing, he moved through Millfield with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. His steel-gray hair was always perfectly groomed, his black judicial robes were immaculate despite the dusty frontier conditions, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated accent of Virginia's gentleman class, a reminder that he came from a world far removed from the rough frontier settlement he now called home. Crawford had arrived in Millfield shortly after the courthouse construction began, carrying impeccable credentials from the University of Virginia Law School and letters of recommendation from prominent Richmond attorneys. His legal knowledge was undeniable. He could quote vast passages of Virginia legal code from memory, cite precedents that dated back to English common law, and construct arguments that would have impressed the most learned jurists in the state. The townspeople considered themselves extraordinarily fortunate to have such a distinguished legal mind in their midst, especially given their remote location and limited resources. But there was something unsettling about Judge Crawford that the townspeople couldn't quite articulate, a quality that made conversations with him feel like interrogations even when discussing the weather. He never married, despite several attempts by local families to introduce him to eligible young women from neighboring towns. When asked about his bachelor status, he would smile tightly and explain that his devotion to the law left little time for domestic considerations. "Justice is a jealous mistress," he would say, "and she demands complete devotion from those who would serve her properly." Crawford kept no servants, maintaining his large two-story house entirely by himself, despite having the means to employ help. The house itself was as impressive as the courthouse, a Greek revival mansion with white columns and wraparound porches that seemed more suited to a Virginia plantation than an East Texas lumber town. Visitors to the house, rare though they were, noted its spotless condition and the extensive library that filled 2 entire rooms. The books ranged from legal texts to theological works, with a particular emphasis on texts dealing with divine justice, moral philosophy, and what Crawford called the purification of the human soul. Most peculiar of all was Crawford's insistence on handling all prisoner transfers to the state penitentiary personally, refusing the assistance of local law enforcement or federal marshals. This was highly unusual, as most frontier judges were eager to delegate such mundane responsibilities to others. But Crawford treated each transfer as a sacred duty, claiming that the condemned men deserved his personal attention during their final hours in the community. "The law is a sacred trust," he would explain to anyone who questioned his methods, "and I will not delegate my responsibilities to others who might lack the proper understanding of divine justice. These men have been placed in my care by God and the people of Texas, and I will see that they receive the treatment their souls require." The Methodist congregation, led by their circuit preacher who visited monthly, had grown accustomed to Crawford's irregular attendance at services. He would appear for Easter and Christmas, sitting alone in the front pew with a somber expression that suggested deep contemplation of spiritual matters. During these services, he would sing the hymns in a rich baritone voice and follow along with the scripture readings in his personal Bible, a massive leather-bound volume that he carried everywhere. But he never participated in the social gatherings that followed services, politely declining invitations to Sunday dinners and church socials. Some whispered that he was haunted by memories of the war, pointing to the fact that he never spoke of his Confederate service despite his obvious military bearing. Others suggested that he was simply a man who preferred solitude to company, a scholar who found more satisfaction in books than in human fellowship. The more charitable interpretation was that his dedication to justice required a kind of monastic discipline that left little room for ordinary pleasures. The town's other notable institution was the combination jail and courthouse basement, where Crawford held prisoners awaiting trial or sentencing. The jail portion was visible to the public, a modest holding area with 4 cells that could accommodate perhaps a dozen men at most. The cells were equipped with basic amenities: wooden bunks, chamber pots, and barred windows that provided adequate light and ventilation. Prisoners held in these cells were fed regularly and allowed visitors, in accordance with standard practices throughout Texas. But the basement extended far beyond what visitors could see, stretching deep into the earth beneath the courthouse in a network of chambers that Crawford had designed and supervised personally. He kept the basement locked at all times with multiple heavy-duty padlocks and reinforced iron bars, claiming it contained sensitive legal documents and evidence that required protection from the elements and potential thieves. Martha Kellerman, the courthouse cleaning woman, was one of the few people who had been granted access to portions of the basement during daylight hours. A widow in her 50s who had taken the cleaning job to support herself after her husband's death in the war, Martha was known throughout Millfield for her discretion and work ethic. Crawford trusted her with access to the upper levels of the basement, where she cleaned the document storage areas and evidence rooms under his careful supervision. Even these limited glimpses of the basement had left Martha with questions she was afraid to voice. The chambers she was allowed to clean were far more elaborate than necessary for simple storage, with stone walls that had been carefully mortared and floors that were surprisingly level and well constructed. The air in these rooms carried a strange mixture of odors, the expected mustiness of underground spaces combined with something sharper and more unpleasant that she couldn't identify. Crawford had explained that the basement's extensive construction was necessary due to the unstable soil conditions in East Texas, which required deep foundations and careful engineering to prevent collapse. He pointed to similar construction techniques used in Virginia cellars and wine cellars, demonstrating his knowledge of architecture and engineering that impressed Martha, even as it failed to entirely satisfy her curiosity. The pattern that would eventually claim 89 lives began in the bitter winter of 1866, though nobody noticed it at first. The transition was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that it seemed like nothing more than the natural evolution of a frontier justice system finally finding its rhythm. Men would be sentenced in Crawford's courtroom for various crimes: horse theft, assault, robbery, desertion from the Confederate Army, disturbing the peace, and then simply vanish into what everyone assumed was the efficient machinery of Texas justice. It was a harsh winter that year, with ice storms that knocked down telegraph lines and made travel between communities nearly impossible for weeks at a time. The isolation that usually characterized Millfield became even more pronounced, creating the perfect conditions for Crawford's activities to go unnoticed by the outside world. Federal authorities, already overwhelmed by the challenges of Reconstruction, had little time or resources to monitor the activities of a remote courthouse in the East Texas wilderness. The first victim whose disappearance would later be documented was a man named Thomas Burke, an Irish immigrant who had been accused of stealing chickens from a neighbor's farm. Burke had arrived in Millfield only months earlier, seeking work in the lumber mills and hoping to earn enough money to bring his wife and children over from County Cork. He had no family in Texas, no powerful friends to advocate for his interests, and no legal representation beyond Crawford's own perfunctory appointment of counsel. The trial itself was conducted with Crawford's characteristic attention to legal procedure. Witnesses were called, testimony was heard, and Burke was given the opportunity to speak in his own defense. But there was something theatrical about the proceedings, as if Crawford was performing the rituals of justice rather than actually pursuing it. The outcome seemed predetermined, and Burke was sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary for what should have been a minor offense. Thomas Burke, Crawford intoned from the bench, his voice carrying the weight of divine judgment. You have been found guilty of theft in violation of the laws of Texas and the commandments of Almighty God. You will be remanded to my custody for immediate transfer to the state penitentiary, where you will serve 2 years at hard labor. May this punishment serve to purify your soul and prepare you for a more righteous life upon your release. Burke was led away in shackles, and that was the last anyone in Millfield ever saw of him. Crawford explained that he had arranged for Burke's transfer during the night, as he preferred to conduct such business away from the public eye. "There's no need to make a spectacle of these proceedings," he told the few townspeople who inquired. "The man has a right to maintain some dignity even in his disgrace." But it was Martha Kellerman who first noticed that something was amiss with these transfers. As the courthouse cleaning woman, she arrived early each morning to sweep the floors, dust the furniture, and prepare the building for another day of legal proceedings. She'd expected to find evidence of Burke's departure, perhaps muddy footprints from the transfer wagon, or paperwork left on Crawford's desk. Instead, she found nothing at all to suggest that anyone had entered or left the building during the night. When she mentioned this observation to Crawford, he explained that he had become quite efficient at conducting transfers without disturbing the courthouse's normal operations. "I take pride in leaving no trace of these unpleasant necessities," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The people of Millfield shouldn't have to be reminded of the criminal elements in our midst every time they enter this building." As the winter progressed and the list of sentenced prisoners grew longer, Martha began to notice other peculiarities that troubled her increasingly restless sleep. Crawford was working later and later into the night, his office windows glowing with lamplight well past midnight. She could see the light from her small cabin behind the courthouse, and she often found herself lying awake, wondering what legal business could possibly require such dedication during the dark hours before dawn. More disturbing still were the sounds that occasionally drifted through the courthouse's thick walls during these late-night sessions. Martha had cleaned buildings all her life, and she knew the difference between the normal settling of timber and stone and the sounds of human activity. What she heard from the courthouse basement during Crawford's midnight sessions sounded like voices, muffled conversations, occasional shouts, and sometimes what sounded disturbingly like sobbing or moaning. When Martha finally worked up the courage to ask Crawford about these sounds, his explanation was both plausible and somehow unsatisfying. "The acoustics in that basement are quite peculiar, Martha," he told her with his characteristic patient smile. "Sound carries in unexpected ways through those stone chambers. What you're hearing is probably the settling of the building or perhaps rats in the walls. Old buildings make all sorts of mysterious noises, particularly during the winter months when the temperature changes stress the materials." But Martha had grown up in a farmhouse that was over 50 years old, and she knew every sound that an aging building could make. What she heard from the courthouse basement wasn't the creaking of timber or the scurrying of rodents. It was human voices, speaking in tones of desperation and fear that made her skin crawl with unnamed dread. She began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings at the courthouse, noting details that had previously escaped her notice. Prisoners would enter Crawford's courtroom for sentencing, but they never seemed to leave through the front door. When she asked about this, Crawford explained that he preferred to conduct transfers through the basement entrance to avoid creating a spectacle for the townspeople. "These men have families, Martha, even if those families have disowned them for their crimes. There's no need to parade them through the streets like circus animals. I arrange for their transport through the basement entrance, where they can maintain some dignity in their final moments in our community." The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the picture Crawford was painting. She had never seen a prison transport wagon anywhere near the courthouse, despite Crawford's claims that transfers were happening regularly. The road behind the courthouse, where such a wagon would logically wait, showed no signs of heavy traffic or the distinctive wheel ruts that would be left by a loaded prison transport. Martha began to notice other details that seemed inconsistent with Crawford's explanations. The judge was ordering an unusual amount of supplies for the courthouse, far more than would be necessary for the few prisoners typically held overnight before transfer. His monthly orders from the general store included enormous quantities of food: hardtack, salt pork, beans, and cornmeal in amounts that could feed dozens of men for extended periods. When the store owner mentioned this to Martha, Crawford's explanation was that he was stockpiling supplies in case of severe weather that might delay transfers. Even more concerning were the medical supplies that Crawford ordered with increasing frequency: bandages, laudanum, surgical instruments, and other items that seemed excessive for treating the minor injuries that might occur during normal courthouse operations. When Martha questioned this, Crawford explained that he had taken on the responsibility of providing medical care for prisoners who arrived at his courthouse in poor condition. "Many of these men have been living rough before their arrest," he told her. "They arrive here suffering from malnutrition, untreated injuries, and various ailments that require attention before they can be safely transferred to the state penitentiary. I consider it my Christian duty to ensure that they receive proper medical care during their time in my custody." But it was the smells that occasionally wafted up from the basement that truly convinced Martha that something was seriously wrong. Having grown up on a farm, she was familiar with all the ordinary odors of life and death, the smell of slaughtered livestock, rotting vegetables, and human waste. But what she occasionally detected coming from the courthouse basement was something different and infinitely more disturbing. There was the metallic scent of blood, but not the fresh blood of a recent injury. This was the thick, cloying smell of blood that had been spilled in large quantities and allowed to congeal. There was also a sickly sweet odor of decay that reminded her of the time a cow had died in a remote pasture and hadn't been discovered for several days. Most disturbing of all was a sharp chemical smell that burned her nostrils and made her eyes water. The unmistakable odor of lime and lye, substances used for breaking down organic matter. When Martha finally confronted Crawford about these smells, his reaction was the first time she had ever seen him display anything resembling anger. His usual calm demeanor cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "Mrs. Kellerman," he said, his voice taking on a sharp edge that made her step backward instinctively, "I would strongly advise you to focus on your cleaning duties and leave the administration of justice to those qualified to handle such matters. The basement contains evidence from various criminal cases, including some rather unpleasant incidents involving livestock theft and property damage. What you're detecting is likely the odor of preserved animal remains and chemical preservatives used in evidence storage." The explanation was delivered with Crawford's usual authority, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was no longer entirely convinced of his own ability to maintain his carefully constructed deception. Martha nodded and retreated to her cleaning duties, but she had seen enough to know that whatever was happening in the courthouse basement had nothing to do with evidence storage or normal legal procedures. That night, Martha began keeping a careful record of everything she observed at the courthouse. She noted the names of prisoners brought before Crawford for sentencing, the dates of their trials, and the official explanations for their subsequent disappearances. She recorded the unusual orders Crawford placed with local merchants, the strange sounds and smells coming from the basement, and the judge's increasingly erratic behavior during their brief conversations. By the spring of 1867, Martha's careful documentation revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. 37 men had been sentenced in Crawford's courtroom and had subsequently vanished without a trace. None of them had been seen boarding prison transport wagons. None of their families had received word from them after their supposed transfers, and none of the state prison facilities had any record of their arrival. As the long winter of 1866 gave way to a wet and muddy spring, the missing prisoners began to haunt the collective memory of Millfield in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The disappearances had been gradual enough that no single incident raised immediate alarm, but the cumulative effect was beginning to create an atmosphere of unease that permeated every aspect of life in the small community. Wives and mothers began arriving at the courthouse with increasing frequency, seeking information about their husbands and sons who had vanished into Crawford's custody. These women came from throughout East Texas, some traveling for days through dangerous territory to reach Millfield and demand answers about their missing loved ones. They brought with them letters from state prison authorities confirming that no prisoner by their husband's or son's name had been received, despite Crawford's official documentation claiming that transfers had been completed. Sarah Morrison was perhaps the most persistent of these desperate women. A devout Methodist and the wife of Samuel Morrison, the church deacon who had been convicted of grain theft, Sarah refused to accept Crawford's explanations for her husband's disappearance. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and determination, having managed her family's small farm single-handedly during her husband's service in the Confederate Army. Her questions were pointed and well-informed, and her refusal to be intimidated by Crawford's judicial authority made her a natural leader for the other worried families. "Judge Crawford," Sarah said during one of her weekly visits to the courthouse, "I've traveled to Huntsville personally and spoken with the warden at the state penitentiary. They have no record of receiving my husband, despite your written documentation claiming he was transferred 3 months ago. I've also contacted the federal authorities responsible for prisoner transport, and they have no record of any transfers from this courthouse. Where is my husband?" Crawford's response to such challenges was always the same: patient explanations about bureaucratic inefficiency, lost paperwork, and the chaos that still plagued Texas government in the aftermath of war and Reconstruction. He spoke with the authority of a man who understood the complexities of the legal system far better than his questioners, and his explanations were delivered with such confidence that many people found them convincing despite their obvious inconsistencies. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand your distress and I sympathize with your situation. But you must understand that the state government is still recovering from the disruptions of the war. Records are being lost. Prisoners are being transferred between facilities without proper documentation, and communication between various institutions is unreliable at best. Your husband was lawfully convicted and sentenced, and he was transferred according to proper procedures. The fact that prison officials cannot immediately locate his records doesn't mean he has vanished. It simply means that the bureaucracy is overwhelmed and disorganized." But Sarah Morrison was not a woman who accepted convenient explanations when they contradicted obvious facts. She began conducting her own investigation, traveling throughout East Texas to interview families of other missing prisoners and compile evidence that challenged Crawford's official narrative. What she discovered was a pattern of disappearances that extended far beyond her husband's case. Thomas Burke, the Irish immigrant who had been the first to vanish, had promised to write to his wife in County Cork as soon as he was settled in prison. The letters never came, and Burke's wife had begun writing to Texas authorities seeking information about her husband's fate. Her letters had been forwarded to Crawford, who responded with vague assurances that her husband was serving his sentence and that communication would be restored once administrative problems were resolved. Jacob Mueller, a German farmer who had been convicted of assault after a dispute with his neighbor, had similarly failed to contact his family after his supposed transfer to the state penitentiary. Mueller was known throughout his community as a man who wrote to his relatives in Germany every month without fail. His sudden silence was completely out of character and deeply troubling to those who knew him. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of Benjamin Hawkins, a young man from a prominent East Texas family who had been convicted of horse theft. Hawkins' father was a successful merchant with connections throughout the region, and he had hired attorneys to trace his son's fate after the supposed transfer to state prison. The attorney's investigation had revealed that no prisoner transport had left Millfield on the date specified in Crawford's transfer documentation, and no such transport had arrived at any Texas prison facility during the relevant time period. As Sarah Morrison compiled these cases and many others, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Crawford was documenting prisoner transfers that had never occurred, claiming to follow legal procedures that left no actual evidence of their implementation. The missing men represented every level of East Texas society, from poor immigrants like Thomas Burke to the sons of wealthy families like Benjamin Hawkins. The only thing they had in common was that they had all disappeared after being sentenced in Crawford's courtroom. Sarah's investigation also revealed troubling details about Crawford's personal behavior that had previously been dismissed as mere eccentricity. Several townspeople reported seeing lights in the courthouse basement at all hours of the night, often accompanied by sounds that suggested intensive activity of some kind. The local blacksmith mentioned that Crawford had ordered an unusual number of metal implements, chains, locks, bars, and other hardware that seemed excessive for normal courthouse security. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah discovered that Crawford had been purchasing enormous quantities of lime and lye from merchants throughout the region, always paying in cash and refusing to explain the intended use of these chemicals. Lime and lye were common enough substances on the frontier, used for everything from construction to soap making, but the quantities Crawford was ordering suggested industrial-scale applications that made no sense for a courthouse operation. When Sarah confronted Crawford with this evidence, his response revealed the first cracks in the calm facade he had maintained for so long. His usual patient explanations became shorter and more defensive, and his eyes took on a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm beginning to find your persistent questioning both inappropriate and disrespectful. I am a duly appointed judge, carrying out my responsibilities according to Texas law. If you have concerns about legal procedures, you're welcome to file a complaint with the state authorities. But I will not tolerate continued harassment in my own courthouse." The threat was delivered with cold precision, and Sarah realized for the first time that Crawford was not simply an incompetent bureaucrat, but potentially something much more dangerous. She began to share her findings with other families and concerned townspeople, building a network of people who were asking the same troubling questions about the fate of their missing loved ones. Martha Kellerman became a crucial ally in this informal investigation, sharing her observations about Crawford's strange behavior and the disturbing sounds and smells coming from the courthouse basement. Martha's testimony carried particular weight because of her position as courthouse employee and her reputation for honesty and discretion throughout the community. "Something terrible is happening in that basement," Martha told the growing group of concerned families. "I hear voices down there at night, voices of men who sound like they're in pain or terror. Judge Crawford claims it's just the building settling or rats in the walls, but I know the difference between building sounds and human voices. Those are men crying out for help, and nobody is listening." The group began meeting secretly in the Methodist church, using their shared faith as both comfort and motivation for their investigation. They prayed for guidance in their search for the truth, and they found strength in their conviction that God would not allow such evil to go unpunished indefinitely. Sarah Morrison emerged as their unofficial leader, organizing their efforts and maintaining detailed records of their findings. But their investigation was hampered by Crawford's position of authority and the general reluctance of law enforcement to challenge a sitting judge. The local sheriff was a political appointee who owed his position to Crawford's influence, and federal authorities were reluctant to investigate based on what they considered unsubstantiated rumors and family complaints. The missing men had all been convicted criminals after all, and their disappearance could be explained by administrative incompetence rather than criminal activity. As summer approached, the tension in Millfield became increasingly palpable. Crawford's behavior grew more erratic and defensive, while the families of missing prisoners became more vocal in their demands for answers. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal the true scope of the horror that had been hidden beneath the courthouse floors. The breakthrough that would eventually expose Crawford's crimes came from the most unexpected source imaginable. A young man who was widely regarded as simple-minded, but possessed survival instincts that would prove sharper than those of far more educated men. Billy Tate was barely 19 years old, illiterate, and had been dismissed by most of Millfield's residents as a harmless vagrant who lived by his wits and occasional odd jobs. But his intimate knowledge of the East Texas wilderness and his natural cunning would make him the key to unraveling Crawford's carefully constructed deception. Billy had been arrested in late May 1867 for stealing a horse from a farmer outside of town. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been caught riding the stolen animal and had no plausible explanation for how he had come to possess it. But Billy's case differed from the previous prosecutions in one crucial respect. Unlike the previous victims, he had grown up in the forests around Millfield and possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate in darkness and survive in hostile conditions. The trial itself followed Crawford's now familiar pattern. Billy was appointed a defense attorney who made only perfunctory efforts on his behalf. Witnesses testified to the defendant's obvious guilt, and Crawford delivered a sentence that seemed disproportionately harsh for the crime committed. Billy was sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary, despite the fact that horse theft was typically punished with much shorter terms. William Tate, Crawford intoned from the bench, his voice carrying its usual tone of divine judgment. You have been found guilty of horse theft, a crime that strikes at the very foundation of civilized society. Your actions demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for the property rights of honest citizens and the moral order that binds our community together. You will be remanded to my custody for immediate transfer to the state penitentiary, where you will serve 3 years at hard labor. May this punishment serve to correct your wayward nature and restore you to the path of righteousness. But unlike the previous victims, Billy Tate was not led quietly away to accept his fate. His experience living rough in the East Texas wilderness had taught him to trust his instincts about danger, and everything about Crawford's courthouse triggered his deepest survival instincts. When the bailiff approached to escort him to the holding cells, Billy's entire body tensed with the alertness of a wild animal sensing a predator. Billy was initially held in the regular jail cells that were visible to the public, sharing space with 2 other men who were awaiting trial for minor offenses. During his 3 days in these cells, he had the opportunity to observe Crawford's routine and study the layout of the courthouse building. What he noticed immediately was that Crawford spent an extraordinary amount of time in the basement areas that were supposedly used only for storage, often working there late into the night with sounds of activity that seemed inconsistent with document filing or evidence cataloging. More significantly, Billy noticed that Crawford seemed to be preparing for something special. The judge ordered additional supplies from the general store, including rope, metal restraints, and medical equipment that seemed excessive for a simple prisoner transfer. Crawford also spent considerable time studying Billy specifically, watching him with an intensity that went far beyond normal judicial interest in a convicted criminal. On the evening before his scheduled transfer, Billy was moved from the public jail cells to a holding area in the basement that Crawford claimed was more secure. This was the first time Billy had been taken below ground level, and what he found there immediately confirmed his worst fears about Crawford's true intentions. The basement was far more extensive than anyone above ground had realized. Crawford had constructed a complex network of chambers and corridors that extended deep into the earth beneath the courthouse, creating what amounted to a secret prison that could hold dozens of men without any possibility of detection from the outside world. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stone blocks. The floors were paved with brick, and the ceilings were supported by heavy wooden beams that spoke to careful engineering and substantial investment. But it was the evidence of long-term occupation that truly terrified Billy. The holding cell where he was placed showed clear signs of having housed multiple prisoners for extended periods. The straw covering the floor had been changed recently, but underneath, Billy could see stains that suggested previous occupants had suffered injuries or worse. The walls bore scratches and markings that looked like attempts to keep track of time or leave messages for future prisoners. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that echoed through the basement during the night hours. Billy could hear voices coming from deeper chambers, the voices of men who were clearly in distress, sometimes crying out in pain or pleading for mercy. These were not the sounds of men awaiting comfortable transport to state prison. They were the sounds of men who had been subjected to systematic abuse and who had given up hope of rescue. Billy's survival instincts, honed by years of living on the margins of civilized society, told him that he was in mortal danger and that escape was his only chance of survival. Unlike the previous victims, however, Billy possessed skills that made escape a realistic possibility. He had grown up breaking into abandoned buildings and finding ways through locked doors, and his small size and natural agility gave him advantages that larger men would not have possessed. Over the course of his first night in the basement, Billy carefully examined his cell and the surrounding area, looking for weaknesses in Crawford's security arrangements. What he discovered, was that Crawford's attention to the psychological aspects of imprisonment had exceeded his attention to purely physical security measures. The basement chambers were designed to be escape-proof primarily through intimidation and despair, rather than through impregnable construction. Billy noticed that one of the stones in his cell wall was slightly loose, apparently having been weakened by water seepage over time. Working carefully through the night, he managed to widen the gap enough to remove the stone entirely, creating an opening that led to the building's foundation area. From there, he could access a drainage tunnel that Crawford had apparently overlooked during his security preparations. But Billy's escape was complicated by what he observed during his second day in Crawford's custody. He was taken from his cell to what Crawford called examination, a process that revealed the true scope of the judge's depravity and the fate that had befallen the previous prisoners. Billy Tate's examination took place in a chamber deep beneath the courthouse that Crawford had constructed with the meticulous attention to detail of a man pursuing his life's work. The room was larger than any of the holding cells, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of lamplight. The walls were lined with the same carefully fitted stone blocks that characterized the rest of the basement, but these stones showed stains and discoloration that spoke to activities far removed from normal judicial proceedings. Crawford had transformed himself for these sessions, exchanging his judicial robes for a simple black cassock that gave him the appearance of a medieval monk or inquisitor. His demeanor was completely different from the calm, professional manner he displayed in his public courtroom. Here, in the depths of his secret chambers, he radiated an intensity that was both terrifying and somehow religious in its fervor. "William Tate," Crawford began, his voice echoing off the stone walls with unnatural resonance. "You stand before the throne of true justice, where the superficial laws of men give way to the eternal laws of divine righteousness. The proceedings upstairs were necessary theater, performed for the benefit of those who lack the spiritual insight to understand the true nature of justice. But here, in these sacred chambers, we will undertake the real work of purifying your soul." The chamber contained devices that seemed to have been inspired by medieval Inquisition chambers, but crafted with the precision of a man who understood both engineering and human anatomy. There was a wooden chair equipped with leather straps and metal fixtures that could be adjusted to cause varying degrees of pain and restraint. Nearby stood a table covered with surgical instruments, some of which Billy recognized, and others that seemed designed for purposes that had nothing to do with medicine. Most terrifying of all was Crawford's obvious expertise with these devices. He moved among them with the familiarity of long practice, adjusting straps and testing mechanisms with the casual efficiency of a craftsman preparing his tools for another day's work. It was clear that Billy was not the first person to be brought to this chamber, and the judge's practiced movement suggested that many others had preceded him. "The process of spiritual purification requires complete honesty," Crawford continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon delivered to a congregation of one. "You must confess not only the crimes for which you were convicted, but every sin you have ever committed, every impure thought you have entertained, every moment when you have strayed from the path of righteousness. Only through complete confession and appropriate penance can your soul be prepared for the judgment that awaits us all." Billy had encountered religious fanatics before during his wanderings through East Texas, but Crawford's intensity went far beyond ordinary evangelical fervor. The judge seemed to genuinely believe that he had been divinely appointed to carry out a mission of spiritual purification that transcended ordinary legal procedures. His eyes held the glassy certainty of a man who had convinced himself that his actions, however horrific, were justified by a higher purpose. Crawford began his interrogation with seemingly innocent questions about Billy's childhood, his family background, and his education. But gradually, the questioning became more invasive and disturbing, probing into areas of personal experience that had nothing to do with the horse theft conviction. Crawford seemed particularly interested in Billy's sexual experiences, his religious beliefs, and any incidents in his past that might be construed as morally questionable. "You see, William," Crawford explained during a brief pause in the questioning. "The crime for which you were convicted is merely a symptom of a deeper spiritual corruption that has taken root in your soul. Horse theft is an act of pride and rebellion against the natural order that God has established. But to truly cleanse your soul, we must identify and address all the sins that led you to this moment of criminality." When Billy refused to confess to sins he had never committed, Crawford began to employ the devices he had so carefully prepared. The process began with relatively minor discomfort: tight restraints that limited circulation, uncomfortable positions that caused muscle cramps and joint pain. But Crawford was a patient man, and he seemed to take genuine pleasure in the gradual escalation of suffering that he could inflict on his victims. "Pain is a gift from God," Crawford explained as he adjusted the restraints that held Billy in an increasingly uncomfortable position. "It serves to focus the mind on spiritual matters and to burn away the pride and stubbornness that prevent us from acknowledging our sins. Every moment of suffering brings you closer to the spiritual honesty that your soul requires." But Billy's experience living rough in the wilderness had given him a tolerance for discomfort that Crawford had not encountered in his previous victims. More importantly, Billy's natural cunning allowed him to understand that Crawford's process was designed to break down psychological resistance rather than to simply inflict pain for its own sake. By providing Crawford with the confessions he sought, Billy could buy time to plan his escape while avoiding the more severe tortures that the judge was clearly prepared to employ. Over the course of several hours, Billy spun an elaborate tale of fictional sins and crimes, drawing on stories he had heard from other criminals and vagrants during his travels. He confessed to thefts he had never committed, fights he had never fought, and moral transgressions he had never contemplated. Crawford listened to these confessions with obvious satisfaction, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "Excellent, William," Crawford said as Billy concluded his fabricated confession. "You are making remarkable progress toward spiritual honesty. But confession alone is not sufficient for true purification. It must be followed by appropriate penance that will demonstrate your sincere repentance and prepare your soul for divine forgiveness." It was during this discussion of penance that Billy began to understand the full scope of Crawford's depravity and the fate that had befallen the 87 men who had preceded him into these basement chambers. Crawford's idea of appropriate penance involved systematic torture that could continue for weeks or months, depending on the severity of the sins that had been confessed and the judge's assessment of the victim's spiritual progress. Crawford had developed an elaborate theological framework for these torture sessions, claiming that physical suffering was necessary to drive out sin and prepare the soul for divine judgment. He quoted extensively from biblical passages about purification through fire and the value of suffering in achieving spiritual growth. But his interpretations of these passages were so twisted and self-serving that they bore no resemblance to any legitimate Christian theology. "The process requires patience, William," Crawford explained as he showed Billy some of the more sophisticated torture devices he had constructed. "Some souls are more corrupted than others, and the degree of purification required varies accordingly. I have had subjects who achieved spiritual clarity within days, while others required months of intensive treatment before their souls were properly prepared." The casual way Crawford discussed these treatments made it clear that he had been conducting them regularly for at least the 18 months since the disappearances had begun. Billy realized that he was looking at a man who had tortured and murdered dozens of people while convincing himself that he was carrying out God's work. The combination of genuine religious belief and complete moral corruption was more terrifying than simple criminal brutality would have been. But Billy also noticed something that Crawford seemed to have overlooked in his meticulous planning. The judge's obvious pride in his work was making him careless about security. Crawford was so eager to explain his theological theories and demonstrate his equipment that he was revealing details about the basement's layout and his daily routine that a more cautious criminal would have kept secret. During his second night in the basement, Billy was able to observe Crawford's activities in the other chambers where the remaining prisoners were being held. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the fate of the missing men, while also revealing weaknesses in Crawford's operation that might make escape possible for someone with Billy's particular skills. The basement contained more than a dozen separate chambers, each one designed for specific purposes in Crawford's twisted version of justice. There were holding cells similar to the one where Billy was confined, torture chambers equipped with various devices for inflicting pain, and what appeared to be medical facilities where Crawford attended to prisoners who had been injured during their spiritual treatments. Most disturbing of all was what Crawford called his meditation chamber, a room where he kept the bodies of prisoners who had died during their purification process. The bodies were preserved with lime and other chemicals, arranged in positions that suggested Crawford spent considerable time studying the effects of his various torture methods. The sight of these preserved corpses, combined with Crawford's matter-of-fact discussion of their spiritual progress at the time of death, convinced Billy that escape was not just desirable, but absolutely essential for his survival. Billy's observations also revealed that Crawford was not the methodical, careful operator he appeared to be during daylight hours. The judge's nighttime activities were characterized by increasing desperation and loss of control, suggesting that the psychological pressure of maintaining his deception was beginning to affect his mental stability. Crawford talked to himself constantly during these sessions, engaging in rambling theological discussions with imaginary opponents and frequently contradicting his own previous statements about proper procedure. Most significantly, Billy noticed that Crawford had been drinking heavily during his nighttime sessions, consuming substantial quantities of wine while conducting his spiritual examinations. The alcohol seemed to make Crawford more talkative and less attentive to security details, creating opportunities for a sufficiently cunning prisoner to exploit his captor's decreasing vigilance. On his third night in Crawford's custody, Billy finally put his escape plan into action. He had been working steadily on the loose stone in his cell wall, widening the opening enough to squeeze through into the building's foundation area. From there, he could access the drainage tunnel that led to the building's exterior, though the passage would require him to crawl through several hundred feet of narrow, water-filled conduit in complete darkness. Billy waited until Crawford had begun one of his late-night drinking sessions before attempting his escape. The judge's attention was focused on a prisoner in one of the other chambers, and the sounds of Crawford's spiritual examination would mask any noise Billy might make during his escape attempt. Working quickly but carefully, Billy removed the loose stone and squeezed through the opening into the foundation area. The drainage tunnel was even more challenging than Billy had anticipated. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the standing water reached almost to his chest in some sections. The air was stale and difficult to breathe, and the complete darkness made navigation extremely difficult, even for someone with Billy's experience in confined spaces. But his determination to escape Crawford's basement chambers overcame all physical obstacles, and after what seemed like hours of crawling through the narrow tunnel, he finally emerged into the open air behind the courthouse. Billy's first instinct was to run as far and as fast as possible from Millfield and Crawford's reach. But his experience in the basement had revealed horrors that he knew must be exposed, regardless of the personal risk involved. Billy had seen the faces of men who were still alive in Crawford's chambers, men whose families were searching for them, and who deserved rescue if such a thing was still possible. Instead of fleeing into the wilderness, Billy made his way to Martha Kellerman's cabin behind the courthouse. Martha was the one person in Millfield who had consistently questioned Crawford's explanations and who might be willing to believe Billy's account of what was happening in the basement chambers. Billy's arrival at Martha's door in the early hours of the morning, covered in mud and shaking with exhaustion and terror, marked the beginning of the end for Crawford's carefully constructed deception. Martha Kellerman's small cabin behind the courthouse had never been the scene of such momentous events as those that unfolded in the pre-dawn hours of June 15, 1867. When Billy Tate appeared at her door, covered in mud from the drainage tunnel and shaking with a combination of exhaustion and terror, Martha's first instinct was to provide him with food and shelter. But as Billy began to relate his experiences in Crawford's basement chambers, Martha realized that she was hearing testimony that would change everything the people of Millfield believed about their community and their respected judge. Billy's account was delivered in a breathless rush of words, interrupted by moments when his emotions overwhelmed his ability to speak. But despite his obvious distress, his story was remarkably detailed and consistent, filled with specific observations that could only have come from someone who had actually witnessed the horrors he described. Martha listened with growing horror as Billy described the elaborate network of chambers beneath the courthouse, the torture devices Crawford had constructed, and the systematic abuse that had been inflicted on dozens of prisoners over the course of 18 months. "Mrs. Kellerman, you got to believe me," Billy pleaded, his voice hoarse from his ordeal in the drainage tunnel. "There's men down there who are still alive, men who've been missing for months. Judge Crawford's got them chained up in cells, and he's been torturing them every night. He thinks he's doing God's work, purifying their souls or some such madness. But what he's really doing is murder, plain and simple." Martha had suspected for months that something was seriously wrong with Crawford's operation, but Billy's testimony revealed a scope of depravity that exceeded her worst fears. The sounds and smells she had noticed coming from the basement suddenly made horrible sense, and Crawford's strange behavior took on a sinister significance that she had not previously understood. But Martha was also a practical woman who understood that Billy's word alone would not be sufficient to convince the townspeople or the authorities that their respected judge was a mass murderer. Crawford's position of authority and his reputation for legal expertise would make it easy for him to dismiss Billy's account as the desperate lie of an escaped criminal seeking revenge against the judge who had sentenced him. "Billy, what you're telling me is so terrible that people won't want to believe it," Martha said carefully. "Judge Crawford has been respected in this community for years. We need more than just your word to convince people that he's been committing these crimes. Is there any way to prove what you're saying?" Billy's response revealed that his time in Crawford's basement had provided him with detailed knowledge of the layout and contents of the secret chambers, knowledge that could be used to verify his claims if they could somehow gain access to the basement. He described the locations of specific torture devices, the arrangement of the holding cells, and, most importantly, the identities of prisoners he had seen who were still alive in Crawford's custody. "Samuel Morrison is down there," Billy told Martha, referring to the Methodist deacon whose wife Sarah had been leading the investigation into the missing prisoners. "I seen him with my own eyes, though he's so thin and weak I barely recognized him. And there's others too, men whose names I heard called during the night when Crawford was working on them. If we can get people down into that basement, they'll see I'm telling the truth." Martha realized that Billy's information provided the key to exposing Crawford's crimes, but she also understood that any attempt to investigate the basement would be extremely dangerous. Crawford was clearly a desperate man who had already committed dozens of murders to protect his secret, and he would not hesitate to kill anyone who threatened to expose him. But Martha also knew that she could not ignore Billy's testimony, regardless of the personal risk involved. Too many families were searching for missing loved ones, and too many men were suffering in Crawford's chambers for her to remain silent. She decided to contact Sarah Morrison and the other families who had been investigating the disappearances, trusting that their combined courage and determination would be sufficient to confront Crawford and rescue the surviving prisoners. Martha sent Billy to hide in the woods outside town, while she made contact with Sarah Morrison and the other concerned families. By mid-morning, a group of nearly 20 people had gathered at the Methodist church to hear Billy's testimony and plan their response to Crawford's crimes. The group included not only the families of missing prisoners, but also several prominent townspeople who had been growing increasingly suspicious of Crawford's explanations for the disappearances. Sarah Morrison took charge of the group with the natural authority of a woman who had been fighting for answers for months. After hearing Billy's detailed account of the basement chambers and the systematic torture being conducted there, she organized the townspeople into a delegation that would demand immediate access to the courthouse basement to verify Billy's claims. "We've been asking questions and accepting excuses for too long," Sarah announced to the assembled group. "If what Billy is telling us is true, then our husbands and sons are being tortured and murdered while we stand around waiting for official responses to our inquiries. It's time to take action, regardless of the consequences." The delegation that marched to the courthouse that afternoon included Sarah Morrison, Martha Kellerman, and 18 other townspeople armed with lanterns, axes, and grim determination to discover the truth about the missing prisoners. They arrived at the courthouse to find Crawford in his office, apparently conducting normal business as if nothing unusual had occurred the previous night. Crawford's initial response to the delegation's demands was to rely on his familiar combination of legal authority and patient condescension. He expressed concern about Billy Tate's escape and suggested that the young man's wild stories were the product of guilt and desperation rather than actual observation. "I understand your concerns," Crawford told the assembled townspeople. "But you must realize that William Tate is a convicted criminal who has every reason to fabricate stories that would discredit the legal system that sentenced him." The boy is clearly disturbed, and his tales of underground chambers and torture devices are obvious fantasies designed to generate sympathy and deflect responsibility for his crimes. But the townspeople were no longer willing to accept Crawford's explanations without verification. Sarah Morrison stepped forward as the group's spokesperson, her voice carrying the authority of righteous anger and months of frustrated investigation. "Judge Crawford, we're not here to debate the credibility of Billy Tate's testimony. We're here to demand immediate access to the courthouse basement so that we can verify or disprove his claims for ourselves. If he's lying, then you have nothing to fear from allowing us to examine the areas he described. But if he's telling the truth, then there are men down there who need our help immediately." Crawford's response revealed the first cracks in the calm facade he had maintained for nearly 2 years. His usual measured delivery became sharp and defensive, and his eyes took on a hardness that suggested he was no longer entirely convinced of his ability to maintain his deception through words alone. "I will not allow a mob of hysterical townspeople to ransack official courthouse facilities based on the ravings of an escaped criminal," Crawford declared, his voice rising in both volume and intensity. "The basement contains sensitive legal documents and evidence that could be damaged or destroyed by unauthorized access. If you have legitimate concerns about courthouse operations, you're welcome to file complaints with the appropriate state authorities." But the townspeople had moved beyond the point where official procedures and legal technicalities could satisfy their demands for immediate action. They had heard Billy's detailed testimony, they had observed Crawford's increasingly erratic behavior, and they had endured months of unconvincing explanations for the disappearance of their loved ones. The time for patience and legal niceties had passed. "Judge Crawford," Sarah Morrison said with cold determination, "you can either unlock those basement doors voluntarily, or we will break them down. The choice is yours, but we are going into that basement today, one way or another." Crawford's response was swift and violent, revealing the desperation and instability that had been hidden beneath his judicial robes for months. He disappeared into his office and emerged moments later with a shotgun, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been genuine fear. "You will not enter this building," Crawford snarled, his voice barely recognizable as belonging to the same man who had delivered measured legal opinions from the bench for nearly 2 years. "I am the law in this community, and I will maintain order by whatever means necessary. These proceedings are none of your concern, and I will not tolerate interference with official courthouse business." The standoff that followed lasted for several hours, with the townspeople maintaining their position outside the courthouse, while Crawford barricaded himself inside with his weapon. As the afternoon wore on, and word of the confrontation spread throughout Millfield, more residents joined the crowd outside the courthouse, creating a situation that Crawford could not hope to control through intimidation alone. But it was the sounds coming from the basement that finally convinced even the most skeptical townspeople that Billy Tate's testimony was accurate. As evening approached and Crawford's desperation increased, the careful soundproofing that had concealed his activities for months began to fail. The assembled crowd could hear voices crying out from beneath their feet, voices of men who were clearly in distress and who were calling for help in terms that left no doubt about their circumstances. The sounds from the basement confirmed Billy's account so completely that even Crawford's most loyal supporters could no longer maintain their faith in his innocence. The crowd's mood shifted from suspicious determination to outright anger as the reality of what had been happening beneath their courthouse became undeniably clear. It was at this moment that Reverend Thomas Whitmore arrived in Millfield for his scheduled revival meeting. The Methodist preacher had been traveling the circuit for 15 years, and he had encountered his share of frontier violence and human depravity. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the scene that greeted him as he approached the courthouse in the gathering dusk of that June evening. Whitmore found nearly 50 townspeople gathered outside the courthouse, their faces illuminated by torchlight and marked with the kind of grim determination that comes only when ordinary people are confronted with extraordinary evil. The sounds coming from the courthouse basement had convinced everyone present that a terrible crime was being perpetrated literally beneath their feet, and their patience with legal procedures and official explanations had finally been exhausted. "Brothers and sisters," Whitmore announced, taking charge of the situation with the natural authority of a man accustomed to providing moral leadership during times of crisis, "we cannot allow fear of legal consequences to prevent us from acting in accordance with God's will. If there are men suffering in that basement, then we have a Christian duty to help them, regardless of Judge Crawford's objections or threats." Using axes and crowbars borrowed from the local blacksmith, the townspeople breached the reinforced basement doors that Crawford had installed to protect his secret chambers. The first thing that hit them was the overwhelming stench, a nauseating combination of human waste, decay, medical chemicals, and the unmistakable odor of lime that had been used in unsuccessful attempts to mask the smell of death. Several people were immediately overcome by nausea and had to retreat to the fresh air outside, but those who remained pressed forward into the basement chambers with their lanterns held high and their hearts filled with dread at what they might discover. What they found in Crawford's basement exceeded even Billy Tate's horrifying descriptions. The judge had constructed an elaborate underground complex that stretched far beneath the courthouse, a network of chambers and corridors that had been designed with the meticulous attention to detail of a man pursuing his life's work. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stone blocks, the floors were paved with brick that could be easily cleaned, and the ceilings were supported by heavy wooden beams that spoke to both engineering expertise and substantial financial investment. But it was the evidence of systematic torture and murder that truly revealed the scope of Crawford's depravity. The main torture chamber contained devices that seemed to have been inspired by medieval Inquisition chambers, but constructed with modern engineering principles and a detailed understanding of human anatomy. There were restraining devices designed to hold victims in positions that would maximize their suffering, surgical instruments that had been used for purposes that had nothing to do with medicine, and elaborate contraptions for inflicting precisely calibrated amounts of pain. The holding cells were even more horrifying than the torture chamber. Crawford had constructed more than a dozen separate chambers for containing prisoners during his extended purification processes, each one equipped with chains, restraints, and primitive sanitation facilities that spoke to long-term occupation. The straw that covered the floors had been changed regularly, but underneath the townspeople could see stains and discoloration that told the story of months of human suffering. But it was the discovery of the living prisoners that truly broke the hearts of the townspeople who had come searching for their missing loved ones. 37 men were still alive in Crawford's chambers, though many of them were barely recognizable as the healthy individuals who had disappeared from Millfield over the previous 18 months. Samuel Morrison was among the survivors, though he was so emaciated and traumatized that his wife Sarah collapsed when she first saw him. The Methodist deacon who had once been a pillar of his community was now a hollow-eyed shadow of his former self, his body bearing the marks of months of systematic torture, and his mind damaged by psychological abuse that had been designed to break his will and reshape his personality according to Crawford's twisted theological theories. "Sarah," Morrison whispered when he recognized his wife among the rescuers, his voice barely audible and filled with the wonder of a man who had given up hope of ever seeing another familiar face. "Is it really you? I thought I would die down here without ever seeing you again." Similar scenes of reunion and horror played out throughout the basement as family members discovered loved ones they had been searching for since the previous winter. But many of the survivors were in such poor physical and mental condition that their rescue came almost too late to save them. Crawford's purification process had left permanent scars on both their bodies and their minds, damage that would require years of care and healing to overcome. The dead prisoners were found in the deepest chambers of Crawford's complex, their bodies disposed of in lime pits that the judge had constructed with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all his work. The lime had preserved many of the remains well enough for identification, allowing the townspeople to finally learn the fate of men who had been missing for over a year. The total count of Crawford's victims eventually reached 89 men, making his courthouse basement one of the most horrific crime scenes in the history of Texas. Crawford himself was found in his private chambers, seated at his desk with an empty bottle of laudanum beside him and his service revolver in his hand. He had apparently taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his exposure. But even in death, he had left behind a testament to his twisted philosophy in the form of detailed journals that documented his methods and his justifications for what he had done. The journals, written in Crawford's precise handwriting and filled with biblical quotations and theological arguments, revealed a man who had convinced himself that he was carrying out God's will by subjecting prisoners to suffering that would purify their souls before divine judgment. He had developed an elaborate framework of religious justification for his torture sessions, claiming that physical pain was necessary to drive out sin and prepare the soul for salvation. The weak-minded fools who call themselves judges content themselves with sending men to prison, where they will serve their time and emerge unchanged in their fundamental corruption. Crawford had written in one particularly chilling passage, "But I have been chosen to carry out true justice, to purify souls through suffering and prepare them for the judgment that awaits us all. The pain I inflict is not cruelty, but mercy, not punishment, but salvation." The discovery of Crawford's journals provided a window into the mind of a man who had used religious conviction to justify the most appalling crimes, transforming his courthouse basement into a chamber of horrors that surpassed anything in the medieval dungeons that had inspired his methods. The aftermath of the courthouse basement discovery sent shockwaves throughout East Texas and beyond, creating ripples that would be felt for generations in the community that had unknowingly harbored one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The immediate task of caring for the 37 surviving prisoners required resources that the small town of Millfield simply did not possess, forcing the residents to reach out for help to larger communities and government authorities who had previously shown little interest in their remote settlement. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a physician from Marshall who had studied in Philadelphia before moving to Texas, arrived in Millfield within days of the discovery to assess the medical needs of Crawford's survivors. Her examination revealed the full scope of the physical damage that had been inflicted on the prisoners during their months or years in captivity. Many of the men suffered from malnutrition so severe that it had caused permanent damage to their organs and nervous systems. Others bore the scars of Crawford's torture devices, including broken bones that had healed improperly, nerve damage from prolonged restraint, and infections that had been left untreated for weeks or months. But it was the psychological damage that proved most difficult to address. Crawford's purification process had been designed not just to inflict physical pain, but to break down the fundamental sense of self that allowed his victims to maintain their sanity during their ordeal. Many of the survivors exhibited symptoms that Dr. Hartwell had never encountered before. A combination of extreme anxiety, periodic catatonia, and a peculiar form of religious mania that seemed to echo Crawford's own twisted theology. Samuel Morrison's recovery became a case study in the long-term effects of Crawford's methods. The Methodist deacon, who had once been known for his cheerful disposition and community leadership, was now a broken man who spoke in whispers and flinched at sudden movements. His wife Sarah devoted herself to his care with the same determination she had brought to investigating his disappearance, but it took months before Samuel could tolerate being in enclosed spaces or hearing raised voices without experiencing panic attacks. "He talks about purification constantly," Sarah confided to Reverend Whitmore during one of the minister's extended stays in Millfield. Judge Crawford convinced him that the torture was necessary for his spiritual salvation, and even now, even after everything we've shown him about Crawford's madness, part of him still believes it. It's as if that monster reached into Samuel's soul and twisted everything good and decent into something dark and frightening. The other survivors faced similar challenges in readjusting to normal life after their experiences in Crawford's basement chambers. Some, like Billy Tate's cellmate Jacob Mueller, eventually recovered enough to resume productive lives, though they carried physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. Others, particularly those who had been held the longest, never fully recovered their mental stability and required permanent care from family members or charitable institutions. The community of Millfield itself struggled to come to terms with the knowledge that they had unknowingly supported and respected a mass murderer for nearly 2 years. Many residents felt guilty about their failure to recognize Crawford's true nature, while others questioned their own judgment and ability to trust authority figures in the future. The courthouse building became a source of shame and horror that nobody in the community could bear to use for official purposes, and it was eventually abandoned and left to decay as a monument to the evil that had been concealed within its walls. Reverend Thomas Whitmore spent weeks in Millfield, providing spiritual counseling to the survivors and their families, while also documenting the full scope of Crawford's crimes for his report to the Methodist Church hierarchy. His investigation revealed details about Crawford's background that explained how he had been able to operate undetected for so long, while also raising disturbing questions about the authenticity of his credentials and the truth about his past. The University of Virginia Law School, when contacted by federal investigators, confirmed that they had no record of anyone named Harrison Crawford graduating from their institution during the time period indicated on his credentials. The letters of recommendation from Richmond attorneys that had secured his appointment as judge were similarly fraudulent, written on letterhead that had been skillfully forged, but which referenced law firms that had never existed. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Harrison Crawford was apparently not the man's real name. Federal investigators eventually determined that the man who had terrorized Millfield was actually Thomas Hartman, a former Confederate intelligence officer who had been reported missing after the fall of Richmond in 1865. Hartman had been involved in prisoner interrogations during the war, where he had apparently developed both his torture techniques and his twisted religious justifications for inflicting suffering on captives. The transformation from Thomas Hartman to Harrison Crawford appeared to have been carefully planned and executed, suggesting that the man who came to Millfield had always intended to use his new identity as cover for continuing the activities he had begun during the war. His choice of a remote Texas community, his careful cultivation of respect and authority, and his meticulous construction of the basement chambers all pointed to a predator who had spent considerable time planning his crimes. Martha Kellerman, whose observations and courage had been crucial to exposing Crawford's activities, became something of a local hero, despite her own modest assessment of her role in the events. She continued working as a cleaning woman for the new courthouse that was eventually built on the other side of town. But she also became an advocate for prisoners' rights and a vocal supporter of reforms designed to prevent similar crimes in the future. "Evil hides in plain sight," Martha would tell visitors who came to Millfield to learn about the Crawford case, "and it's up to ordinary people to recognize it and act. We all saw signs that something was wrong, but we were too polite, too trusting, too willing to believe that a man in authority couldn't be capable of such terrible things. I learned that if something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, and you can't wait for someone else to take action." Billy Tate's escape and testimony had not only exposed Crawford's crimes, but had also saved the lives of the 37 men who were still alive in the basement chambers. The young man who had been dismissed by many as simple-minded became a local hero whose courage and survival skills had prevented an even greater tragedy. He eventually settled in a neighboring county, where he married and raised a family while working as a carpenter and occasional guide for travelers through the East Texas wilderness. But Billy never forgot his experience in Crawford's basement, and he spent the rest of his life advocating for prison reforms and better treatment of prisoners throughout Texas. He testified before state legislative committees about the need for regular inspections of detention facilities and improved communication between courts and prisons. His testimony was instrumental in passing laws that required multiple signatures for prisoner transfers and mandatory reporting of prisoner deaths or disappearances. The case also led to significant reforms in the Texas judicial system, including requirements for more thorough background checks of judicial appointees and regular inspections of courthouse facilities by state authorities. The Crawford case became a cautionary tale that was studied in law schools throughout the country as an example of how the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual, particularly in isolated communities, could enable the most appalling crimes. Sarah Morrison channeled her grief and anger into a lifetime of advocacy for the families of missing prisoners and victims of violent crime. She and Samuel, despite his ongoing struggles with the psychological effects of his captivity, established a foundation that provided assistance to families searching for missing loved ones and support for survivors of prolonged captivity or torture. Their work eventually expanded beyond Texas to help families throughout the South who were dealing with similar tragedies. The Methodist Church's response to Reverend Whitmore's report revealed the institutional challenges of confronting evil that had been cloaked in religious authority. Church leaders were deeply disturbed by Crawford's use of Christian theology to justify his crimes, and they struggled to understand how someone could twist religious concepts of purification and divine justice into justifications for torture and murder. Crawford's crimes represent a fundamental perversion of everything we believe about God's love and mercy, wrote Bishop James Anderson in his official response to Whitmore's report. His use of Christian language and concepts to justify his actions is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire tragedy. It reminds us that the most dangerous false prophets are those who speak in familiar religious terms while serving goals that are fundamentally opposed to everything Christ taught us about love, forgiveness, and human dignity. The Church's decision to seal Whitmore's report for over a century reflected their concern that public knowledge of Crawford's religious justifications might undermine faith in Christianity itself or provide inspiration for other religiously motivated criminals. But when the report was finally released in 1967, it became an important document for scholars studying the intersection of religious extremism and criminal behavior. The physical evidence of Crawford's crimes was carefully documented by federal investigators before the basement chambers were sealed with concrete and lime. The torture devices and other equipment were destroyed, but detailed drawings and descriptions were preserved for use in training law enforcement officers to recognize similar crimes in the future. The courthouse building itself was eventually demolished in the 1920s, and the site was converted into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of Crawford's crimes. The psychological impact of the Crawford case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The residents of Millfield struggled for years with questions about their own complicity in the crimes through their failure to recognize Crawford's true nature. Many people blamed themselves for trusting authority too readily or for ignoring warning signs that seemed obvious in retrospect. Dr. Hartwell's ongoing study of the survivors provided some of the first detailed documentation of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though the terminology and treatment methods available in 1867 were far less sophisticated than modern approaches to trauma recovery. Her notes described symptoms that would be familiar to any modern psychologist: intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and a persistent sense of danger that made normal social interaction extremely difficult. The economic impact of the scandal was also significant for the small community of Millfield. The negative publicity associated with the Crawford case made it difficult to attract new residents or businesses to the town, and many existing residents chose to relocate to communities that weren't associated with such horrific crimes. The population of Millfield never recovered from the exodus that followed the courthouse basement discovery, and the town eventually became a virtual ghost town by the early 20th century. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Crawford case was its demonstration of the power of ordinary citizens to confront evil when official authority fails to protect them. The courage shown by people like Martha Kellerman, Sarah Morrison, and Billy Tate proved that regular people could make a difference when they were willing to trust their instincts and take action despite personal risks. The story of Judge Crawford's courthouse basement serves as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often those who cloak themselves in the trappings of respectability and authority. Crawford's crimes were enabled not by supernatural forces, but by the ordinary human tendency to trust those in positions of power and to avoid asking uncomfortable questions about inconsistencies in official explanations. The 89 men who suffered in Crawford's basement were not victims of evil spirits or demonic possession, but of a systematic predator who had learned to hide behind the mask of legal and religious authority. Their tragedy reminds us that justice without accountability becomes tyranny, and that the price of freedom is the eternal vigilance that requires ordinary citizens to question authority and demand transparency from those who hold power over others. The Methodist Church finally released Reverend Whitmore's complete report in 1967, exactly 100 years after the events it described. The document provided historians with a detailed account of one of the most shocking crimes in American history, but it also raised troubling questions about how many other similar cases might have been covered up or forgotten over the years. Whitmore's report concluded with an observation that remains chillingly relevant more than a century after Crawford's crimes were exposed. The capacity for evil lies not in supernatural forces, but in the human heart, and it is only through constant vigilance and moral courage that we can hope to prevent such horrors from occurring again. Judge Crawford's victims were not destroyed by demons or devils, but by the systematic cruelty of a man who had convinced himself that his actions were justified by divine authority. Their suffering reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe most fervently in their own righteousness. The Reverend's words proved prophetic as historians and criminologists began to study the Crawford case in the context of other religiously motivated crimes throughout American history. The pattern of authority figures using religious justification for criminal behavior appeared repeatedly in cases ranging from the Salem witch trials to various cult-related murders that would plague the country in later decades. Modern forensic experts who examined the surviving evidence from Crawford's basement chambers were struck by the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques he had employed. Dr. Michael Harrison, a forensic psychologist who studied the case in the 1970s, noted that Crawford's methods bore striking similarities to those used by modern cult leaders and authoritarian regimes to break down individual resistance and reshape personality according to the manipulator's desires. Crawford understood that physical torture alone was not sufficient to achieve his goals. Dr. Harrison wrote in his analysis of the case, "His real innovation was the integration of psychological manipulation with religious authority to create a system that convinced victims to participate in their own destruction. Many of the survivors reported that they had begun to believe, at least partially, in Crawford's theological justifications for their suffering. This suggests a level of psychological sophistication that was remarkable for its time and terrifying in its implications. The surviving fragments of Crawford's personal journals, preserved despite his attempts to destroy them before his suicide, revealed the gradual evolution of his criminal methodology over the months he spent in Millfield. Early entries showed a man struggling to reconcile his desires for control and dominance with his genuine religious beliefs. But as time progressed, his writings demonstrated an increasingly elaborate theological framework that allowed him to justify any action as divine will. "God has chosen me as his instrument of purification," Crawford wrote in an entry dated December 1866. "The weak and corrupted souls that come before my earthly court require treatment that goes far beyond the superficial penalties imposed by human law. Their sins run deep, like poison in their veins, and only through intense suffering can this poison be drawn out and their souls prepared for divine judgment." Later entries revealed Crawford's growing confidence in his mission and his increasing detachment from normal human empathy. He began to view his victims not as fellow human beings, but as subjects in a divine experiment that he had been specially chosen to conduct. The progression from reluctant participant in God's plan to enthusiastic architect of suffering provided disturbing insights into how ordinary religious belief could be corrupted into justification for the most appalling crimes. The impact of Crawford's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, influencing legal and social reforms throughout Texas and beyond. The case became a rallying cry for prison reform advocates who used Crawford's methods as examples of what could happen when prisoners were held in secret without adequate oversight or protection. The reforms that followed included mandatory inspections of detention facilities, requirements for multiple witnesses to prisoner transfers, and improved communication systems between courts and prisons. Perhaps most significantly, the Crawford case contributed to growing awareness of the need for psychological evaluation of judicial appointees and other authority figures who would have power over vulnerable populations. The recognition that Crawford's crimes had been enabled by his position of trust and authority led to reforms designed to prevent similar predators from gaining access to potential victims through official channels. The town of Millfield itself never recovered from the trauma of the courthouse basement discovery. By 1900, fewer than 50 people remained in the community that had once been home to 400 residents. The abandoned buildings slowly succumbed to the East Texas climate, becoming overgrown with vines and eventually collapsing entirely. Today, only a few foundation stones and the memorial park mark the location where one of America's most horrific crimes was committed. But the memory of Crawford's victims has been preserved through the efforts of their descendants and the historical societies that have documented their stories. Each of the 89 men who suffered in Crawford's basement chambers had families, dreams, and contributions to make to their communities. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but collective losses that impoverished the entire region for generations. The annual memorial service held at the site of the former courthouse has become a gathering place for the descendants of Crawford's victims and for others who want to remember the importance of vigilance against the abuse of authority. Sarah Morrison, who lived to be 96 years old, attended every memorial service until her death in 1943, using the occasions to remind new generations about the need to question authority and protect the vulnerable. "Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks," Sarah would tell the young people who gathered for these memorial services. "It comes dressed in respectability, speaking the language of authority and righteousness." Judge Crawford convinced an entire community that he was a godly man carrying out divine justice, while he was actually torturing and murdering innocent people in his basement. We must never forget that the greatest monsters are often those who claim to speak for God, or country, or law. The psychological studies conducted on Crawford's surviving victims provided important insights into the long-term effects of prolonged captivity and torture that would prove valuable to researchers studying similar crimes in later decades. The detailed documentation of their symptoms and recovery processes contributed to the development of more effective treatments for trauma survivors and better understanding of how the human mind copes with extreme stress and abuse. Dr. Hartwell's notes on Samuel Morrison's case became particularly important to researchers studying what would later be termed Stockholm Syndrome, the tendency of captives to develop positive feelings toward their captors as a survival mechanism. Morrison's persistent belief that his torture had been spiritually beneficial, despite overwhelming evidence of Crawford's criminal insanity, demonstrated how powerful psychological manipulation could override rational thought, even in intelligent, well-educated individuals. The legal precedents established by the Crawford case influenced court decisions throughout the United States for decades after the crimes were discovered. The case was cited in arguments for prisoners' rights, judicial oversight reform, and the protection of vulnerable populations from abuse by authority figures. Legal scholars studying the case noted that Crawford's crimes had been enabled by a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of a single individual without adequate checks and balances. The religious community's response to Crawford's crimes sparked important theological discussions about the nature of evil and the responsibility of religious institutions to prevent the corruption of their teachings. The Methodist Church's decision to establish new training programs for ministers and improved systems for identifying and addressing religious extremism was directly influenced by their horror at how Crawford had twisted Christian concepts to justify his actions. The case also influenced the development of criminal psychology as a field of study, providing one of the first detailed examinations of a serial killer who used religious authority to facilitate his crimes. Criminologists studying the Crawford case identified patterns of behavior that would later be recognized in other religiously motivated criminals, contributing to the development of psychological profiles that could help law enforcement identify similar predators before they could claim additional victims. Billy Tate's remarkable escape and his crucial testimony became the subject of numerous studies by experts in survival psychology and resistance to psychological manipulation. His ability to maintain his sense of reality and personal identity, despite Crawford's systematic attempts to break down his psychological defenses, provided important insights into the factors that allow some individuals to resist even the most sophisticated forms of psychological torture. The courage shown by ordinary citizens like Martha Kellerman and Sarah Morrison in confronting an authority figure they suspected of criminal behavior became a model for civic engagement and social responsibility that was studied in schools throughout Texas for generations. Their willingness to risk personal safety and social ostracism to protect others demonstrated the power of individual conscience to triumph over institutional authority when that authority had been corrupted. The Crawford case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of systematic torture and murder in American criminal history, providing a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in concentrating power without accountability. The detailed records preserved by Reverend Whitmore, Dr. Hartwell, and other contemporary observers have allowed subsequent generations to study the case in remarkable detail, ensuring that the lessons learned from this tragedy continue to inform efforts to prevent similar crimes. The physical site of Crawford's crimes has been transformed from a place of horror into a place of remembrance and education. The memorial park established on the courthouse grounds includes plaques commemorating each of Crawford's 89 victims, ensuring that their names and stories will not be forgotten. The park also features educational displays that explain the historical context of the crimes and the reforms they inspired, helping visitors understand how such tragedies can be prevented in the future. The annual gathering of survivors' descendants has evolved into a broader conference on prisoners' rights, judicial reform, and the prevention of institutional abuse. Speakers at these conferences include legal experts, psychologists, human rights advocates, and survivors of similar crimes from around the world. The Crawford case has become a touchstone for discussions about the balance between authority and accountability in democratic societies. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crawford case is its demonstration that ordinary people have both the power and the responsibility to confront evil when they encounter it. The townspeople of Millfield could have chosen to accept Crawford's explanations and avoid the risks associated with challenging his authority. Instead, they chose to trust their instincts, investigate his claims, and ultimately take action to protect the innocent. This terrifying chapter in Texas history reminds us that justice without transparency becomes tyranny, and that the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe they are acting in the name of righteousness. The 89 men who suffered in Crawford's basement were not victims of supernatural forces, but of a system that failed to protect them from a predator who had learned to hide behind the mask of legal and religious authority. Their story serves as a permanent warning about the price of complacency and the importance of questioning those who claim to speak with divine or governmental authority. In a democracy, the ultimate responsibility for preventing such crimes lies not with government officials or religious leaders, but with ordinary citizens who must remain vigilant against the abuse of power and willing to act when they encounter evidence of wrongdoing. The Methodist Church's decision to finally release Reverend Whitmore's complete report in 1967 came at a time when America was struggling with questions about authority, institutional responsibility, and individual conscience. The Crawford case provided historical context for contemporary debates about civil rights, the Vietnam War, and the responsibility of citizens to resist unjust authority. What do you think about this dark chapter in Texas history? Do you believe there might be other cases like Crawford's that have been covered up or forgotten over the years? The systematic nature of his crimes and the sophistication of his psychological manipulation techniques suggest that he may not have been unique. There could be other predators throughout history who used similar methods to victimize those under their authority. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if you've heard similar stories from your own community or family history. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the darkest chapters of our past, and it's crucial that we continue to study these cases to prevent similar tragedies in the future. If you found this investigation as disturbing and eye-opening as I did, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's most shocking historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the truth is often more terrifying than any fiction we could imagine, and that the responsibility for confronting evil lies with each of us, regardless of how powerless we might feel in the face of institutional authority.